Greetings, Resident Evil fanatics. It's getting dark out here. It seems that dusk is falling faster than it has in months now. What could be causing this? It's during these dark nights that I feel a certain precariousness, a certain worry. Do you feel it too? It's inescapable, really. It is said that at this time of year, the veil that conceals our world from the other is sure to be rattled and perhaps even shattered. Thus, it's only natural that our apprehensions soar to new heights. How can we combat these feelings? Well, the one thing I have strived to demonstrate, if nothing else, is that we have but one hope against the dark and the sinister. Stories, accounts of those who have overmastered their tormentors. Only with these tales of the intrepid, or at least those who appear as such, and through these accounts of the dauntless, or those who seem so, can we stand firm in the face of evil. Be it Oni, vampires, demons, abominations of viral engineering, or any other entities that may encroach upon our kind, we can always call upon tales of their defeat, and pull from them what we so require. Tonight, I have one such tale to share with you, and should such monsters dare to walk this world that we inhabit, you will be no stranger to their capabilities. The only question, then, is this. Are you ready to receive this indispensable knowledge, to hear this invaluable account? I would hope so, as I've already hired a specialist, a scholar in such ghastly matters, to guide us. Say hello to this certain someone. The wisdom I wish to impart tonight is not my own. It is the wisdom of this erudite individual. In fact, all insights that I disseminate into this world, both through digital and physical means, result from this scholar's influence on me. Most recently, the scholar has insisted that I interpret this particular tale and share my findings with you thereafter, a novel by the name of Resident Evil Underworld. Well then, you have a decision to make. The road ahead is a bothersome one. Never should you feel ashamed for turning back. So I'll ask you one more time. Are you hungry enough, daring enough to explore this novel's contents with me? If so, then let us begin. Brace yourself, as this one's going to get scary. What's that? Qualms? I'm dissatisfied with aspects of this novel? Really? You've come to one of the few folks who praises these books so fervently, only to witness a rather unforgiving header that reads, "My qualms." Could I possibly be saying that tonight I'm not going to gloriously acclaim this story for the entirety of this analysis? Is that even conceivable, given my previous input on this series? Yes, it is, and now is the time to do so. So why am I doing this now, during this entry in particular? Let me ask you a question. Why do you suppose I spend this much time and energy on these books? How much do you think I even enjoy them? Considering the authors and writing styles I tend to gravitate towards, Junichiro Tanizaki, H.P. Lovecraft, and Franz Kafka to name a few, I even find myself asking the same question. Why do I extol these Resident Evil novels as vehemently as I do? If I may be blunt, these books don't hold a candle to the profound messages and distinct writing styles boasted by any of the aforementioned authors, and that's perfectly fine, as they weren't intended to be like such. They weren't written to be deeply influential tales in a literary sense. They're basic novelizations of pre-existing stories, which themselves were quite rudimentary, down to their very conception. And so, the novelizations were written to be as consumable and as straightforward as is appropriate, and, as a result, regular readers may regard them as quite generic, a bit bland. To those unfamiliar with the Resident Evil franchise, these novels may even register as forgettable. But of course, we RE fanatics cherish them for what they are. Yes, they certainly provide a greater depth of characterization and world building than the games tend to offer, and I've sought to illuminate such contributions time and time again. But purely from a writing standpoint, I can fathom why some, especially upon cursory glances, may deem these books to be mere articles of fan fiction, rather than recognized alternatives, or perhaps supplements, to the narratives of Resident Evil. It's judgments like these that threaten the legitimacy of these novels in the eyes of fans and outsiders alike. They're practically set at an elementary school reading level, maybe middle school, another reason why some readers may dismiss them as juvenile or otherwise vapid. While they do contain scenes that exhibit the inner energies of our beloved characters, often enhancing the in-game events they represent, just as many scenes are riddled with overly cheesy and hackneyed writing, both in terms of the plot itself and the descriptions that string it along. Yes, I said that. So, if these criticisms can be directed at most entries in this series, why am I holding this entry in particular, Underworld, to a greater degree of scrutiny than all the rest? Why now? Because it is precisely those two aspects of this novel, the plot and the manner in which it's woven together, through Perry's words, that are especially stuck in their delivery here, and therefore warrant a more critical lens of interpretation. It's the book's more hackneyed scenes and characters, its more trite ideas that often prove cumbersome to the other, more additive passages, weighing down on the book's potential like anvils hanging from the wings of an eagle. I must say, Underworld has proven itself a bizarre concoction of character redemption arcs, cohesive world building, and otherworldly monsters that all show promise, as well as some very cliched characters and unoriginal writing, even in a franchise that I so often understand as formulaic. The novel's oddities, or in some chapters, lack thereof, have earned it a spot beneath my magnifying glass, and its hand, by which it has committed such atrocities, shall earn its rightful, sorry place beneath my gavel, tonight. Yes, the wrath of my judgment shall befall this novel. Courtroom, commence. I am the judge, and you are our jury. Your Honor, or rather, my honor, thank you for hearing my opening statement. Yes, I will be both prosecuting and defending as is necessary, and I will be the sole entity eligible to do so. The defendant will be tried on multiple accounts of narrative heresy. Let us begin the trial of Resident Evil, Underworld. Here we have Exhibit A, the flight. Let us scrutinize the defendant's victories and shortcomings in its first act. If you are at all familiar with my approach to dissecting Resident Evil media of any kind, be it literature, film adaptations, or games, then I take it you're aware of my Resident Evil formula, and if you're not, this is a loose enumeration of the recurring themes, tropes, and character archetypes that constitute a Resident Evil story. While these traditional elements are indubitably present in this novel, building in an exoskeleton that certainly qualifies it as Resident Evil, a number of its scenes are rather uninspired in their execution, and far too many characters meet their ends, be it through demise or triumph, in an overly predictable manner. This is not to imply that Underworld blights the continuity of the series. In fact, much to the contrary. It embellishes upon many characters that remain exclusive to the Perryverse, but its plot does strike me as artificial, as manufactured, almost to the degree of being conceived programmatically through some type of AI. And you may think, wait a moment, I object. If we're analyzing this novel through the lens of the formula, and it adheres to such narrative elements quite closely, is that not exactly what we're looking for? Objection overruled. In part, yes, we're looking for some loose amalgamation of these items, but it's not all that we're looking for, and rigid adherence to the formula can be equally as detrimental as deviating too far from it. I do view Resident Evil entries as formulaic to a degree, as narratives that are all slight distortions of these tried and true trademarks. But those distortions are the true allure of Resident Evil. It's those nuanced deviations that make or break an entry, that distinguish its thematic essence from all the rest. These distortions may manifest through the antagonist's vision, the pathogen at play, the bioweapons born of that pathogen, the mental games orchestrated by the villains, or the stories told by the structures in question. I found multiple of these aspects to be all but automated in this book. Save for maybe the extraordinary designs of the bioweapons, this story is as vanilla as they come. So, what is it about Underworld's plot and writing that lands so stock and so formulaic? Let's start with the site of interest. Labyrinthine structures in an isolated region. Is a laboratory here. That's it. No mansions, no prisons, no police stations, no lighthouse, no clock tower, and no castles. Nothing like any of those. Just one laboratory, nothing more. Sure, it has some surprises for us, as does every RA laboratory, but to have our heroes start and end their search for truth in one sole structure, and the default structure at that, is beyond basic. Let's backtrack for a moment and uncover how our heroes arrive at this bland location. How does the tale begin? With our heroes locked and loaded in a large van driven by John Andrews, the passengers, Rebecca Chambers, David Trapp, Leon Kennedy, and Claire Redfield, rain bullets upon their pursuers, umbrella agents who return fire from their own vehicles. David here, as is the case for the rest of the story, effectively reprises his role as captain. Before long, the stars escape, almost entirely unscathed, but rattled and exhausted. They yearn to reunite with their comrades, Jill, Barry, and Chris, who had ventured out to Umbrella's headquarters, which, in the Perryverse, lies somewhere in Austria. To do this, the stars rendezvous with the pilot of a private jet, which of course is when Trent emerges and exposits critical information, bringing about the archetypal briefing scene. Again, a very default hook for these novels, and good God, do I have a lot to say about Trent tonight. But let's start with the others, as there's some inner monologue and banter that builds off of their past endeavors. Yes, I suppose that for this moment, I'll be the defendant's advocate. Fine. Though all 5 of them are nearly depleted of their energies, following the car-to-car gunfight, only a couple are able to get any rest at all. Their apprehensions keep them painfully alert as the plane sets its course. Leon proves himself one of the unrested, still aching and writhing from the abominable night that had befallen him in Raccoon City, and from the memories of a woman he'd learned to respect and cherish, who had pried him from death's grimy fingers many a time, Ada Wong. And the aftermath, his escape with Claire Redfield and Sherry Birkin, who was now in the custody of Annette's sister, had left him doubting his true place in the matter. As the flight goes on, Leon continues second-guessing his involvement, stirring with the nebulous cloud of thoughts and feelings, until finally, he asserts that this is what's sparking his anxieties. He believed in what David and his people were doing, and it wasn't that he was afraid. That wasn't it at all. Standing against Umbrella was the right thing to do. It was that he didn't feel qualified to be there. He immediately denounces his own self-evaluation, deeming it stupid, but despite this, he gives the thought some credit and even justifies every other crew member's reason for being there. From a narrative sense, this is a brief but sufficient method of recapping the events of previous novels through the characters that endured them. When he lands on himself, though, he recounts his one sole night on the job, taking on tasks and grisly entities infinitely more daunting than the standard police work he'd imagined doing. Was he ready for all this? How could he be, a rookie cop facing down the war monsters of an international corporation, only ever permitted to operate in the shadows without the military and legal support that the stars desperately needed? As seen through the events of the Umbrella Conspiracy, Caliban Cove, and City of the Dead, Umbrella had usurped command of the stars across multiple states, luring them with promises of money. Wesker and Irons were just the beginning. Only a mere handful of the stars, those in Texas, Oregon, and Montana to name a few, could still be trusted. Perhaps it was this burden that plagued Leon's mind and murked his moral compass, exacerbating his woes. But was it really the reason for his second guessing? He wondered. Enter Claire, mumbling a word or two in her sleep in the seat next to him. The one person to whom he had poured out his heart, unloading all the indescribably complex traumas of that hellish night, after which she reciprocated without hesitation. Together, they had pieced together a coherent story of the night's happenings, made some sense of the madness, and by letting loose their feelings, they'd paved a path, or at least a semblance of one, to recovery. Leon is unable to discern how much of his feelings toward her are defined by his PTSD, and how much of them were a sea of other feelings, warmth, connection, dependence, respect, and others that he had no name for. One of those others, perhaps, is a shred of self-consciousness or shame based on his response to reflecting on Claire. He thinks, "What you're really afraid of is that you're only here because she is, and you don't like what that says about you." Following it shortly after is, he didn't like the idea of being led around by some neurotic compulsion to be close to Claire Redfield. Thankfully for his own sake, he concludes at last that his reason for taking part in this was insignificant, and that Umbrella would get their just desserts no matter what. This early passage is a rather nuanced answer to the question, how would Leon fare mentally in the aftermath of Resident Evil 2, after Ada's presumed demise? It tethers his experience to Claire's in a manner that isn't immediately apparent during RE2, but is hinted at in their brief encounters that night. On top of this, though, it sets up nicely for his current adventure, as, like it or not, Leon and John practically bathe in the spotlight of this tale. The other three heroes, their little moments of glory aside, are essentially appetizers for you to consume alongside the main dish, which of course is these two. Speaking of those other three, Rebecca's relationship with David has evolved considerably since Caliban Cove. David expresses a level of transparency commensurate with Rebecca's experience here, as he's perfectly aware of her intellectual and emotional maturity at this point, and doesn't bother to sugarcoat the truth. As she speaks with him, she recognizes the drab expression etched into his visage. His face had conveyed such grim emotions for many days now, of a dull, continual disquiet, a feeling that was monstrously amplified during the bleakest moments of their previous journey, a journey that had planted seeds of self-doubt within him, and quite abundantly so. David's anguish as a leader has lessened, but it has not fully subsided. Pay attention to their arc later to see how this relationship develops. As for John, he continues to poke at Rebecca with his snarky humor, persistently one-upping her whenever feasible. They jest back and forth about the plane's apparent susceptibility to fatal, inevitable crashes, and of course, John insists on having the last laugh. Not bad. Once again, his humor serves as a fitting counterbalance to the graver, more intense introspection of Leon's passages. Let's return to that now, as I've been playing defense attorney for some time, and I'd like a chance to flip the script. I can feel it, that chance. It's lurking in the curtains. And conveniently enough, after Leon's barrage of self-analytical chutes and ladders, he makes his way towards those curtains to grab something to munch on, and voila! Out comes this stock character, Trent. I'd like your permission to play prosecution now. Oh wait, I don't need your permission. Here it comes. I'd like to direct your attention to the overly cheesy character writing here. Ever since Trent's debut in the first novel, he has always served as a plot device for the stars as their source of leads and hints. But my god, does he turn up the schlock factor of every scene he's written into. No Trent passage can stand without him coming across as unfalteringly cool and impossible to rattle, and the writing makes that as clear as day, almost forcibly so at times. For instance, take the scene where he approaches Jill Valentine in the first novel. A shadow separated itself from the back of the room and stepped forward, a tall man with a low, musical voice. He then verbalizes his advice and hands the micro supercomputer to Jill, and then suddenly, Trent opened the door, and just like that, he was gone. He disappears like this every time. The short banter in between isn't awful, it suffices for the sake of his character, but what really irks me about this is the writing that almost immediately follows it. Jill felt like she was in some melodramatic old spy movie and had just met the mysterious stranger. It was laughable. This is one recurring description I've seen Perry use in regard to Trent and in her characterization of the Spencer Mansion, and even in regard to some bioweapons. She compares them to movies or some buzzy pop culture phenomenon, rather than letting them stand alone as descriptions for the reader to interpret. Like, I'm aware that Trent scene was generic and corny. I don't need it to be compared to a nameless, stock spy movie to reinforce that. I'm not a fan of this, not even one bit. When Chris encounters the first zombie in the Spencer Mansion, one line reads, he'd seen enough late-night movies to know what he was looking at. There it is again. Very little intrigue is actually built by comparing T-virus carriers to the famous creature they resemble. I understand that this is a fathomable response for Chris coming across one for the first time, but it rings tiresome to read this over and over again. Just a handful of pages later, Chris thinks, just like in the movies, dangerous, but dumb. These lines feel like vapid substitutes for what could be distinct, engrossing descriptions that would much better encapsulate the nuances of this creature. Again, I don't necessarily think that Perry's imagery and descriptors are inadequate as a whole in these passages, but they are often generic enough to get bogged down by these cheesier lines. In one of Wesker's passages, just 20 or 30 pages later, this happens again to characterize the enigmatic design of the Spencer mansion. It reads, "Spencer was bats, no two ways about it, and he'd had the house built with all kinds of tricky little mechanisms, a lot of that silly spy crap that had been so popular in the late 60s. And then in Wesker's inner monologue, he thinks, spy crap that's going to make this job twice as hard as it needs to be. Hidden keys, secret tunnels, it's like I'm trapped in an espionage thriller, complete with mad scientists and a ticking clock. I rest my case. This is exactly the kind of writing that dissuades people from amply investing in these novels and leads them to dismiss these works as quote-unquote middle school fan fiction. These descriptions are indeed silly and kinda crappy, and struggle to individuate the writing and therefore the unique atmospheric allure of these characters and scenes. I'm trapped in a spy drama, guys. I'm stuck in an old, crappy espionage thriller. Are these zombies from the movies? Like, no thank you. Doing this often saps the respective scenes of their situational intrigue and tension that is otherwise upheld by feasible descriptions, by feeding us something simpler and dumber to visualize instead. That's just not conducive to effective horror writing at all. Come to think of it, it's one of the most juvenile, underdeveloped aspects of these novels, the incessant reliance on cheap, indistinct descriptions. That was a mouthful. Don't even get me started on how Trent approaches David in Caliban Cove on a dark, rainy night in a trench coat and presents the mission info to David before disappearing without a trace. How original. Delivers what he came to deliver in nondescript garb and then abruptly disappears into the rain-drenched shadows around the side of the house, straight out of a comic book. Then we have his appearance in Underworld. He emerges from the dark curtains after the plane takes off. His composed, icy chill demeanor incurs John's fury almost immediately. The more John tries his hand at scaring the thin man before him, and the more he fails in his intimidation, the angrier he grows. He didn't like the fact that Trent seemed totally unimpressed by his formidable size. Most people backed down when he got in their face. Trent seemed amused. Of course, Trent proves unrivaled in the game of mental fortitude, a game that John was intent on continuing, unprevailingly, for some time, until David chimes in, halting John's aggression, albeit ephemerally. Trent removes his coat and advises the stars to get comfortable. He then asserts that traveling to Europe won't help in their feud against Umbrella, and insists that they set their sights on a separate Umbrella facility, one located in the salt flats of Utah. The objective of this mission is to retrieve one of 3 books, each of which contains a directory of codes to access mainframe data in every White Umbrella facility, a book carried by an elite figure by the name of Reston. More on him later. This is the single longest scene of Trent being physically present and engaging in dialogue with the stars, who all make attempts at probing at his motivations, though all in vain. When asked what his stake in this is, he replies, "Call it a hobby." When asked why he's been so cryptic, offering hints to the stars rather than supplying them with answers outright, he responds, "It was necessary that you appeared to figure it out, all by yourselves." He hints that his minimal involvement is a precaution, a preventative measure to make sure his meddling doesn't come back to bite him. Fascinating. Again, pretty standard briefing scene, and unfortunately, Trent does exit the active plot in the same trite manner that he has multiple times now. Trent turned and walked to the front of the cabin and slipped behind the curtain without a backward glance. He only returns to give the coordinates to the Utah facility. When the plane lands, John even readies himself to pursue Trent, intent on beating some more info out of him, but as anyone would expect, Trent disappears in the few seconds it took John to walk through the tiny plane. When asked about Trent, the airport worker insisted that the first person off the plane had been John himself. Never saw it coming. Yes, it's unimaginative, as were all of his previous disappearances. I feel that this is one character, perhaps more so than any other, that really suffers from the simplicity of this book's writing and tone, And as I've expounded upon earlier, this applies to the whole series really. It almost feels as if the words are outright telling you how you should perceive Trent, to regard him as dauntlessly cool and unerringly omniscient, despite the novel's self-awareness of his cheesiness. The books simultaneously urge us to believe he's as shrewdly competent as he is unfailingly corny, a combination that may warrant some dissonance in the reader, and perhaps some frustration too. But as a saving grace, you'll see this character return later on, in a manner that illustrates the very core of his motives, adding cohesion to his larger vision as it applies to White Umbrella. Well then, Juror, the flight is over, and we've sufficiently analyzed the joys and the ills of the first act. Let's proceed to Exhibit B. The plane lands, and the stars proceed to the quintessential structure of this entry, the aforementioned laboratory, and again, nothing more than that. There are 5 or so other buildings alongside the main one, each of little consequence in the end. Our heroes infiltrate the dark, cold facility with very little trouble. No guards or bioweapons are stationed around the central building, which is auspicious to say the least. As Rebecca illuminates the building's walls in search of a way underground, we're met with yet another movie comparison line, because why not? It reads, "In movies, private detectives and cops who had just crashed someone's house were always strolling calmly around, looking for evidence as if they owned the place. In real life, breaking in somewhere you were absolutely not supposed to be was terrifying." I have nothing more to say on the matter. It's just something Perry's done several times throughout the series that I'll never like, and that's perfectly fine. At least it's somewhat tonally consistent with the rest of the story, despite it feeling like a cop-out for a better description. Very soon after, a poorly concealed security mechanism is uncovered by Rebecca, who finds a 10-key number pad set inside it. David then begins entering codes, eventually landing on the correct one and revealing an empty elevator shaft, the cage rising quickly. John and Leon enter, but wince upon hearing an alert sound, as a red light begins blinking on the elevator's control panel, indicating a manual override. From this point forth, the stars find themselves sliced into 2 units, as John and Leon are sealed off from the other 3 by the rapidly shutting mesh gate. The elevator then descends to the lower levels, while David, Rebecca, and Claire are left at the top. Manual override. Who could have done this? Trent described a higher-up earlier in his briefing, a man named Reston. Well then, what's the defining allure of Reston, this novel's villain? Is this man a proponent of artificial selection, intent on cleansing the human race? Griffith, Spencer, Albert? No. Well, is he perhaps more focused on the revival of the dead and dying? Alex, Miranda, Marcus? Not at all. Is he maybe a treacherous ally, a serpent slithering amongst the heroes, awaiting the opportune moment to engage? Albert, Ada, Nikolai? I'd like to clarify something. I'm not implying that every villain should mimic these 3 popular archetypes, but if Underworld's villain is to deviate, you'd hope he'd at least do it memorably, and as I'll continue to assert, he does not. He's certainly treacherous in his own right, as you'll soon see, but the heroes understand that he's aligned with Umbrella from the very beginning, unlike the aforementioned traitors. Thus, he doesn't attempt a feigned allegiance with the heroes, like most villains from the classic trilogy, but instead operates at an elite position in Umbrella, and despite that, he deeply resents his inferior status in relation to his own superiors. Jay Reston is nowhere near as distinct as the other villains, not as twisted and macabre as Irons, not as rehearsed and enigmatic as Ada, and not as cunning and devilish as Wesker. He's simply the man in the way, quite like a security guard is in the way of a successful robbery. Reston is the type of character that, when one exercises their faculty of imagination, can be sitting inside Perry's easy idea closet in droves, each eagerly awaiting their ephemeral, forgettable appearance in a published medium. And when the opportunity arises, one of them gleefully opens the door in her mind and steps into the story. His very default motivations almost preclude the reader from developing a serious interest in him. He isn't directly involved in the bioweapons creation, he merely supervises their development. Yes, a lowly canine barking progress reports to the true elites of Umbrella. His mission is to prepare the planet, the test facility in question, to showcase the capabilities of various bioweapons to his superiors, higher executives of Umbrella. So, what purpose were these bioweapons devised to fulfill in this entry? Weapons. Umbrella simply yearned to create some playthings, some perilous playthings, come wartime. Nice, the typical motivation of breeding military assets. In case you thought the bioweapons might be thematically tied to the aims of their creator, such as being byproducts of a larger goal, they are not, and we never meet their creator, only Reston. Again, this is not to say that every RE entry should revolve around the creator's ultimate vision, but the best ones certainly do. The story told of that creator's successes and failures is perhaps the most fundamental point of deviation. It's what truly individuates any RE entry. Both the RE Netflix series and this novel failed to capitalize on that essential connection, but I'll at least acknowledge that Underworld's bioweapons are themselves, in terms of design, quite extraordinary, as you'll soon see. Each of the creature's intended combat uses are also nicely detailed by Reston, as he observes how they fare against our heroes. But that's about all Reston does. He's just another power-hungry narcissist character, writhing in his self-imposed feelings of inferiority. His passages are quite like milder, more cliched versions of other neurotic villains, like Perry's writing of Annette, Griffith, and Irons. As he orders his employees around, meticulously preparing for the upcoming visit from his superiors, he begins to romanticize, repeatedly so, how handsomely he'd be rewarded for his showcase. One particular fantasy emerges at the prospect of trapping the heroes in the test suites and collecting combat data via video recording. The data he could collect, the respect that he would earn. I could edit the tapes together, have something to show my visitors after the tour. And won't Sydney be undone when Jackson sees what I've accomplished, how I've handled things? I'll be the golden child for a change. This man is what virtually everyone pictures when they visualize a greedy, white-collar suit who solely seeks to elevate his status in Umbrella. But in Resident Evil, we've seen plenty of characters precisely like such, consumed by avarice, only with infinitely more charisma, guile, compassion, or power. Attributes that not only amplify their intrigue as villains, but also dictate how they'll choose to combat the heroes. Reston is sorely lacking in all of those attributes. He shivers with incompetence at the slightest hints of danger, of worry. His spinelessness is almost reminiscent of Birkin in the RE0 novel, especially in Birkin's scenes with Wesker. So while all other antagonistic agents in these novels boast some distinct ability that flavors their thoughts and behaviors, Reston is the stock version amongst them, the lowly caterpillar among butterflies. This makes it frustrating when John and Leon, searching for him in the lower levels, play right into his ploy, his napkin ruse. Reston commands his electrician, Henry Cole, to lure the two into the test chamber. Cole is just another man working for money, oblivious to and uninvested in the larger vision he's working towards. He fixes a monitor here and checks speakers there, anything that Reston asks for, all while dressed in a blue work shirt and jeans. So, because John and Leon internalize that they're searching for someone in blue, they succumb to the bait immediately upon spotting Cole, chasing him down, and when all three of them dart into the first test suite, Reston seals off the entrance from the control room. He then introduces himself, barely having earned the right to do so. The three guinea pigs have to endure his pretentious opener, which he follows up by demanding their participation in the test suites to collect combat data on the newly engineered bioweapons. Thanks to you, I'll be able to show my little party actual footage of what our specimens were created for. This is where Leon and John dance into the limelight and where those specimens shine as the real stars of this tale. Each of the 4 test suites was devised to mimic a disparate environment, each a synthetic imitation of a habitat that would realistically accommodate the creatures within it. The first of the 4 is a woodland expanse, permeated with the trees and greens associated with any lush forest, and fittingly, it houses a number of gargantuan creatures that perch atop the tallest trees. Rustin refers to these beasts as AV1s, which is essentially an elision of the word aves, meaning birds, despite them being closer in resemblance to bats than anything else, and a bit like pterodactyls. This is why Cole had heard the nickname Dax being used in reference to them. Their descriptions are harrowing enough, certainly adequate to fuel one's imagination, and their gory clashes with John and Leon do satisfy as a first bioweapon encounter. Armed with an M16 assault rifle, John that is, and Leon with a 9mm, they paint the forest grounds with the scarlet entrails of these beings, emerging almost entirely unscathed. They protect Cole, keeping him alive and well as they enter the second suite, which is basically a desert rife with nigh indestructible beings that are quite like the scorpion bioweapons of Resident Evil 0, but not as large. They're aptly nicknamed Scorps here. John finally discovers, though, that one of his other tools proves necessary here, and annihilates them promptly thereafter with his hand grenades. The atmospheric tension here, upon the first read, is quite tangible, and it genuinely instills a sense of unease in the reader, especially as the survivors learn of the uselessness of their primary weapons. I was particularly fearful of John's condition, especially after the grim fate of his allies in Caliban Cove, and through that misfortune, I was conditioned into believing that exclusive characters in original novels were quite disposable. But I later learned that this original story isn't quite as daring as the previous. Rustin, sipping his brandy and watching the battles from the control room, recoils at the possibility of the three men surviving all four suites. He shakes his head in disdain as the Scorps perish, the last of them stabbing each other in a helpless fit of agony. This is another recurring tendency in Perry's writing, and one that I quite enjoy. Bioweapons place their primal, instinctual impulses over their intended purposes. They viciously attack and sometimes feast on whatever faces them, indiscriminately of whether it's the hero's or one of its own. In 0 Hour, for instance, an eliminator begins devouring one of its own kind out of starvation. This heightens the realism of these beings beyond the game world, in which they solely exist to attack the hero, and never deviate from that behavior. Getting back to Rustin, though, there's another tendency in Perry's writing that I find a bit repetitive. I've alluded to this earlier. Many of her villain passages begin to feel quite samey, like a similar blend of neurotic self-reassurance and the facade of control that follows it. Wesker, Annette, Griffith too, they all stir with self-doubt when the heroes make progress, and then promise themselves that X person will pay for this, or that they'll never make it past this bioweapon, like Wesker never anticipating that Jill would make it past the chimeras in the first novel. When Griffith responds to the death of Athens, one of his puppets in Caliban Cove, he responds, "Don't panic, no need for panic," and curses his luck. The same passage ends with him sporting a newfound sense of control and a smile as he awaits the daylight. It reads, his plans wouldn't fail. The righteousness of his work would see him through this invasion. Very entitled. All too similarly, Rustin is described reacting to the intruding stars like this. J. Rustin had not become one of the most powerful men in the country, perhaps in the world, by panicking. The passage then ends by saying, they would pay for causing him even a second of distress. Again, very entitled like Griffith's righteous work, both of them deluded enough in their dark dealings to deem themselves lords of light. Rustin thinking they would pay is also quite like how Umbrella would pay for spoiling the lives of Marcus and Annette, worded in quite the same fashion. In the next Rustin passage, he of course starts by panicking when David punches numbers into the keypad, as viewed through his monitors, and then he resolves it promptly in his mind, plotting to use the manual override on the elevator. After that, this happens. He smiled, a smile entirely without humor, and broke into a run, quite like the Griffith passage of panicking and then smiling after supposedly figuring it out. It's this perpetual cycle of micro-conflicts within the villains' brains during their short passages that always seems written in the same hackneyed manner, with the initial threat of the hero's progress inciting their panic, followed by a shallow redirection of that emotional distress, typically into a devilish sort of motivation, which usually manifests in a corny smile. After reading villain passages of this type so many times over, of course they ring rather generic. If I'm being completely honest, this is likely another consequence of the series' simplistic writing style and the need to write as many villain passages as there are, without ample time or unique descriptors to build them up. So many of Perry's villains can seem like the same shade of neurotic character, do use similar language in expressing their hatred, like making someone pay, and do manifest their redirected fears in similar ways, like that cheesy, evil smile. I hope I've acknowledged the challenge of writing such villains in this style. Back to Underworld now, and of course we have Reston reassuring himself that the stars won't make it past the monsters in the next test suite, then pouring another cup of brandy and lounging in his chair. Case in point. My favorite of the 4 suites is unquestionably this one, the third, in which the strangest being of them all is perched atop the peak of a stone-gray mountain, a bridge beside it, and a deep chasm carved into the earth beneath. This remains perhaps the most surreal imagery of the entire series. A 4-legged creature with split hooves like that of a goat, but with a body speckled with red snake scales, giving off the illusion that it is covered in blood. With an amphibian head, dark bulbous eyes, and a protruding lower mandible like that of a bulldog, this chimeric being is almost comparable to the lion-esque bioweapons of Caliban Cove, like an otherworldly fusion of a snake, a frog, and a goat. What I adore so much about its habitat, the Rocky Mountain Gorge, is that it seems inspired by the Christian book of Revelation, the wrath of the Lamb, a wrath that is administered here by a caustic red tar that it spits from its mouth, earning it the nickname Spitter. This is the reason, in my eyes, to read this novel. The atmospheric tension of this tale reaches its zenith here. After firing some shots and traversing the bridge, Cole and Leon swivel around to aid John. John finds himself collapsing through the bridge beside the mountain's peak, and Leon does all he can to keep the Spitters at bay, distracting them with gunfire and a timely grenade. A couple of tar projectiles come frighteningly close to John's skin, but thankfully, Leon's grenade cripples enough of the Spitters for John to escape. During the previous suite with the Scorps, Cole poured out his guilt to John and Leon, confessing his greed and his blind eye to Umbrella's wrongdoings. The stars are quick to reassure him, and insist that he channel his feelings towards the tall order at hand, and arm him with a 9mm to help the fight. He's a pretty standard, do work, get paid kind of guy, and that's fine. I don't need him to be anything spectacular. He's caught in this plight through Reston's betrayal, and fighting alongside these two helps him reassess what's important. He beams at John's martial prowess after John obliterates the Scorps, and does so again as John safely reunites with him and Leon at the end of Test Suite 3. John playfully slaps Cole on the shoulder and endearingly tells him, "Henry, you're a funny guy." His emotional attachment to them compounds quickly through his dependence on them for survival, and this continues through the entirety of the 4th and final suite as well, a suburban environment akin to a small town with streets and shops. Hunters are the beasts that plague this final suite, and they need no introduction from me. Cole fights bravely along them, blasting and bashing his own share of hunters, but upon reaching the final stretch of Suite 4, a layer of blue wall begins descending over the exit. Leon and John reach it first, and before they pull Cole in as well, a hunter drives its massive talons into Cole's back, tearing easily through his shirt, skin, and even bone, coating him in crimson. In his final moments, he utters the name of the planet's ultimate bioweapon, Fossil, and as a dying wish, he asks Leon and John to set it free, so that it may raise everything in the facility to nothingness. Now, wait a moment. While I wouldn't hold it against the two for honoring Cole's dying wish, doing so before securing an escape route could be disastrous, especially since Reston ordered reinforcements to detain the other 3 stars. And what do John and Leon do? They hit the release button anyway. Considering the amount of precaution they took when they reached the lower levels, keeping their comrades' well-being at the forefront of their thoughts, why would they just release the single deadliest bioweapon in the facility before confirming their teammates' conditions? Because of this, Cole's request comes across as a contrivance, an excuse to have Fossil running around and wreaking havoc during the mission just for the sake of seeing it in action, rather than a genuine answer to Cole's final bidding. And speaking of those 3 stars, what have they been up to this whole time? Frankly, not very much at all, which is precisely why I won't speak on it very much. While Leon and John progressed through the test suites, Rebecca, David, and Claire were hiding upstairs from the reinforcements, taking cover in some of the other buildings, with Rebecca taking 1 bullet in a scuffle, and all of them eventually regained control by taking out a meager 3 guards around the buildings. Think about this. A massive pharmaceutical conglomerate owns a testing facility, guarded by all of 3 guards during the daytime. And by the way, each of them are taken out with the same old tactic, by distracting them with Rebecca's cute face and injuries so that David could take them down. I'm not even going to comment, it's whatever. After they secure the area once again, David uncovers the other end of the elevator shaft that leads underground, which then results in the final scenes of the novel. To their credit though, these 3 do have one notable scene in their passages, in which Rebecca, perspicacious as always, sees the whirling torments of self-doubt in David's mind, once again. This happens immediately after John and Leon are trapped in the elevator by Reston's doing, and the other 3 are left at ground level. David is preemptively wallowing in sorrow, concerned over the possible injury or death of Leon and John, and in his worry, he thinks back to the horrid fates of Steve and Karen during their last mission. Rebecca can see this and promptly commands him to stop it. She asserts that he's not necessarily the captain anymore, as the stars aren't what they used to be. Claire shares similar sentiments, and David finally concedes. It's at least a semblance of closure to his encounter with Rebecca in the first act, and to the festering memories that had haunted his thoughts since Caliban Cove. With that out of the way, let's jump back to the present, where these 3 take the other elevator shaft to the lower levels. At this point, John and Leon have already hit the release switch, a 5-minute timer being set on Fossil, which happens to be a dinosaur-based weapon, because, in case you've forgotten, Juror, the original title of this novel was, in fact, Resident Evil: Jurassic Park. Jokes aside, I've always felt that the core intents of both franchises were one and the same, and fueled by the same fundamental desire: to engineer extraordinary life to actualize one's vehement desires, a desire that is often mutated to serve corporate interest. But in Resident Evil's case, the best entries don't involve that last part, and explore motivations much deeper than creating war soldiers. So, when David, Rebecca, and Claire round the corner, Reston slithers by and takes Rebecca hostage using his gun. Classic don't move or I'll shoot scene. Leon and John meet Reston on the other side and persuade him, quite easily, to release her, and he then disappears into the test chamber on the other side. Soon after, the heroes realize they can't neutralize the monster in time, so they bolt towards the elevator, and of course, we hear the sickening crunch of Reston being devoured by the ultimate bioweapon. As they leave the facility, we learn that Rebecca did in fact snatch Reston's book of codes after all. The final Resident Evil cliché to cap off all the previous ones. That is all. Now, if you'll watch me, Juror, I'm going to play prosecution for some time, as the vapidities of this novel require my attention. I've done what I can to defend each of its major scenes. We already have the one generic location, the standard briefing scene, and Trent cheesing up the whole thing, but an entry point that's entirely unguarded, lock mechanisms that are outmaneuvered in mere paragraphs after entering the facility. Beyond all of that though, this story does not bestow the reader with situational tension or emotional roller coasters quite like the previous novels did. As a prime example, we have Caliban Cove. Being the only other original novel in S.D. Perry's series of 7, it relentlessly feasts on the reader's concerns at all the most scathing moments. It wastes no time, submerging the stars in a suffocating sea of grisly creatures, both figuratively and literally. From that very first encounter with marine bioweapons onward, the inner tumult felt by the heroes, and by the readers as well, is mercilessly amplified by the novel's ghoulish setting and especially by its villain, Nicholas Griffith. This man's infamous legacy as a biochemist, his grand vision of reducing the human race to creatures of primal instinct, and the puppets born of that vision are all conducive to a deeply engrossing RE story. And thus, in contrast to the recent RE Netflix show I might add, his creations are meaningfully tethered to his overarching goals. Griffith's puppets prove their efficacy in the novel's final scenes, employing their human likeness to deceive and destroy the stars. From commanding Rebecca's attention in the novel's opening chapters to the end, in which he orchestrates one of the most shocking death scenes in all of Resident Evil media, Griffith demonstrates his ability to break the stars, to cripple them physically and psychologically, on multiple levels. This is how the novel threatens your emotional well-being. It feeds on your concerns for Karen's deteriorating condition, lures you along with hopes of healing her and securing an escape, and then decimates those hopes with Griffith's final moment of triumph. Caliban Cove, as a novel, is able and willing to capitalize on your emotional investment. But Underworld, on the other hand, is a much more forgiving tale that assigns more narrative focus to the heroes rather than the larger vision of the antagonists. In this original story, the STARS members never quite grapple through any plights that rival those of Caliban Cove. Part of the reason for this, and its lighter overall tone, is that the central villain is little more than a suit, quite literally. He simply doesn't command a presence nearly as domineering as that of Griffith, and instead serves as an integral cog in Umbrella's larger function, especially as it aids the motifs built by the previous novels of treachery and of avarice. But in the end, he proves himself far too trite and predictable to be interesting. Such predictability is what lends too much security to the heroes, and thus the readers as well. Because of this, the narrative struggles to take both the characters and the readers to the depths of despair faced in previous novels. Beyond all of that, though, the cliched writing reaches all sorts of new highs in this entry. There's a crucial distinction between tropes and cliches, which is this. Tropes are tried and true trademarks of a type of story, and most good writing necessitates them to deliver in any given genre. So when we reconcile this with the RE formula, it's essentially a loose enumeration of Resident Evil tropes. Clichés, on the other hand, are almost exclusively detrimental to a given story, and my god are they plentiful here. The villain being conveniently slaughtered by the ultimate bioweapon, the stock briefing scene, the very default laboratory location with nothing to complement it, the very default motivation of creating bioweapons for war, the Perry writing cliché of a villain who neurotically obsesses over losing control and then convinces himself he's regained it in almost all of his scenes, the "I didn't get what we came for, but actually I did" stunt pulled by Rebecca, the "don't move or I'll shoot" stunt pulled by Reston, the "I'm cute and hurt so don't shoot me" also pulled by Rebecca, and numerous others. As for the final Trent scene in the epilogue, I'll let you find out. It's enlightening for sure, nothing game-changing, but it certainly adds cohesion points to the novel and the series as a whole. Well then, Juror, it's time to reach a consensus, to settle on a final verdict. Underworld sparks of potential are only ever ignited by its lone parts, and never do they blossom into an inferno, as the best RE entries often do. Consider this: the RE formula can be conceptualized as a static set of undergarments, and when the formula is sculpted into an RE entry, that story represents the clothes that sit on top of those undergarments, and Underworld feels quite like the default outfit of a character creation system, or like an NPC that you're forced to operate as for one chapter of a game, the game that is Perry's 7 novels. Here's another avenue to understanding, if you'll let me reference Star Trek: The Next Generation. And by the way, Juror, you'll let me, because it's my courtroom, and even if you were to bang your fists on your chest with all the genetic vigor of a feral primate, blow heaps of steam out of your nose and your ears, and, while exuding that steam, let loose a slew of obscenities and expletives alike, you would still be powerless to stop me. With that being said, I'll present you with this metaphor. Thanks for letting me. The character you see here is the child of Data, a highly functioning android of Captain Picard's crew. Her name is Lal. In her innate, unrealized form, she is merely a sinewy mesh of metallic alloys and human flesh, an embryo awaiting actualization. Quite like the Resident Evil formula, which itself is an RE entry in its infancy, this character is a nebulous mixture of primitive thoughts and ideas, and is largely lacking a sense of direction, of definite purpose. Only when Lal inhabits her true vessel and begins the process of socialization, amongst her crewmates does she blossom into her fully individualized self. Her inborn, android-oriented behaviors and knowledge result from her father's android makeup. She learns everything else through imitation, just as we do, really. But being an android, she is unable to process human emotions, nor is she able to replicate them. Or so we first thought. Later into her life, we witness a phenomenon never thought possible. She, an android, begins to feel, to experience human emotions like her father never could.
I love you, Father.
And it's that shattering of boundaries, that brazen subversion which yields a legendary account aboard the USS Enterprise, a tale in which an extraordinary being is ushered into existence through the undying wish of her father. Quite like the exquisite beasts of Resident Evil are devised to answer the underlying wishes of their creators, and quite like Resident Evil's perfect vessels, its champions of artificial selection, Lal possesses a unique ability to detect and feel emotions, bursting free of the constraints prescribed by her father's android makeup. Lal being able to feel is quite akin to Natalia being impervious to fear when all previous vessels shivered in despair, or like Albert gaining superhuman abilities when the other 12 Wesker children either perished or contracted a terminal illness. Like Lal, Resident Evil's perfect vessels represent the unprecedented levels of success and wonder that follow countless failures. In both cases, the storied being represents deviation, individuation from the mundane destinies that they are otherwise fated to. It's the bioweapon, the villain, and the tumultuous journey of finding that perfect vessel for the bioweapon that ultimately distinguish a Resident Evil story from all the rest. Resident Evil's ultimate beings deviate in a manner that proves the fantastic, the impossible, to be possible, just as Lal does. Therefore, the defining nuances of the bioweapons and the creator, the Lal and the data, are a massive point of deviation in most Resident Evil stories, and should be written as such, as I've repeatedly stressed. Only through this point of deviation and many others can a Resident Evil story reach individuation, bursting forth from the rigidity prescribed by the formula. In its embryonic state, a Resident Evil story is quite like this base form of Lal that lacks distinguishing characteristics. Both are merely uncultivated vessels of potential from which they burgeon into their distinct selves. But in Underworld's case, we find that potential to be sparse, and so the vessel largely remains in its formless, infantile state, like Lal if she were to remain in her initial stage indefinitely. As seen in both exhibits, Underworld hardly offers any meaningful deviation and struggles to truly reach individuation. This tale, as a finished story, is rife with fluffy writing and a multitude of cliches. These are certainly grounds for narrative heresy, especially as it applies to Resident Evil stories. Thus, despite its meager moments of redemption, I hereby charge this tale for its heresies and sentence it to 802 days of punishment in the lower levels of House Beneviento. Begone, heretic. Well then, Juror, I thank you for your participation in the trial of Resident Evil, Underworld. I hope you learned something tonight, and you can rest assured that you've exacted justice to a heretical work that evidently deserved it. Let us all be just in our investigations of these stories, now and forever. Such is the wish of our scholar, the certain someone, who has blessed me with the insights I now possess. A number of adherents have risen in the scholar's name. I will read their names now. Tina, War on Horror, Ruben Sayans, Dilated Davies, Buck Rockroyn, George Sykes III, Rachel Zed, Joseph Whitehouse, Thomas Brunner, John Wick, Jareel Moon, and Albert Kessa. Should you also wish to pledge any contributions towards our practice, there is a way to do such a thing, and I'm confident that you'll find it. And should you encounter a Dak, a Spitter, or even Reston himself, I have faith that you'll apply your newfound knowledge to overmaster these evils. Until next time, then, we shall bid you farewell. I'll see you again soon, I'm sure. Perhaps just as heresy is committed once again.